Peter plunged Russia into turmoil when he died without naming an heir to the throne. Some saw Peter's daughter Elizabeth as his natural successor, but the late Tsar's enemies had their own designs on the crown. And at 15, Elizabeth was not ready to fight for power in the ruthless Russian court. And so Elizabeth watched for 16 years as rival factions dragged the Romanov dynasty to the brink of extinction. First her mother, then a nephew, then an estranged cousin took the throne. Hard living, smallpox, death claimed them all. Finally, a distant cousin, a 2-month-old baby boy with hardly a drop of Tsar Peter's blood, was proclaimed Emperor of Russia.
Elizabeth is well aware that her family once were the controllers of the throne, and so she feels some threat that if she doesn't make a play for power, she may suffer even worse consequences. She might be sent to a convent.
Now, with an infant on the imperial throne, Elizabeth sensed opportunity and took action. On November 25th, 1741, Peter the Great's daughter donned a royal guardsman's uniform, rallied her father's most loyal officers, and led her forces in a swift and bloodless palace coup. Her helpless rival, the infant Tsar, was locked away for the rest of his unfortunate life. At 32, Elizabeth seized the crown and her birthright as Empress.
She was brilliant in her transfer of power. She immediately came out with an accession manifesto that said, "I will rule in the spirit of my father and my mother. I will be a reformer. I am a Russian. I will keep Russian interests at heart." We have finally gotten rid of this treasonous group who had occupied the throne and robbed Russia of its riches.
Elizabeth wasted no time naming her own heir. Childless herself, in 1742 the new empress chose her nephew, German-born Peter Ulrich, next in line for the throne.
He was born under the luckiest of stars. The kid, at the moment of birth, could have been the Grand Duke of Holstein, the King of Sweden, or the Emperor of Russia. Now that's a very good bloodline.
At the age of 14, the lucky princeling left his beloved German homeland of Holstein to join the Russian court. There was just one problem. The young Tsar-to-be, Peter III, hated Russia and all things Russian.
He was Empress Elizabeth's nephew, and he was designated by her to be the heir. He was truly a foolish, stupid character.
He was immature. He had a shrill, irritating voice and thought that the height of wit was to stick his tongue out.
Peter's dubious character and open scorn for Russia made him a less than perfect candidate for the throne. To protect the empire and the Romanov dynasty, Elizabeth wanted an heir she could trust, a child of Peter III, but bred from birth to rule and love Russia. What she needed now was a healthy young princess to breed her a baby Tsarevich. And so, in the winter of 1744, the Empress summoned a second young German to her palace, Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst. It was the beginning of a 50-year odyssey, which would transform the daughter of impoverished aristocrats into the most powerful woman on earth, the Empress Catherine the Great.
Catherine realized that this was her great opportunity, that she was from a rather low-ranking German princely family, and that her future in Russia was a lot more promising than anything that she could find in Germany.
Not long after she arrived, the 15-year-old girl was baptized into the Russian Orthodox Church and rechristened Catherine in honor of Elizabeth's own mother. From the start, Catherine eagerly embraced her adopted homeland. The only thing Catherine didn't love about Russia was her fiancé, the German-born heir to the Russian throne, Grand Duke Peter III. The fact that Peter seemed dim-witted and childish didn't help the romance.
Peter's passions were his toy soldiers. He would bring them to bed with them and put them through their maneuvers, and she had to play along.
He would kind of drill her and march her around and this kind of thing. She got tired of that.
She walked in one day to find a rat hanging from a rope, and he explained to her that the rat had committed treason and that he was paying the penalty. So this is what she was dealing with in terms of a husband, an imbecile.
Fireworks lit the skies on the night of the royal wedding. In the bridal bed, fireworks were out of the question. In the arena of court politics, producing an heir to the throne would soon be a matter of survival. Under the circumstances, delivering on that job might take Catherine more time than expected, and perhaps a little extramarital assistance. In 1753, after 8 years of marriage, the Grand Duchess Catherine, wife of the heir to the Russian throne, finally lost her virginity, but not to her husband, the Grand Duke Peter. The Empress Elizabeth expected Catherine to produce the next generation of Romanovs. With her husband unwilling or unable to help, the Grand Duchess followed the advice of her friends and gave her heart and body to a willing courtier, Serge Saltykov.
She was encouraged to have this affair with Serge Saltykov, and this apparently was an attempt to get both Peter and Catherine more at home with matters sexual, and then to get them together to produce the promised heir.
With Peter off doing his thing, leaving her lonely and abandoned, the one role that she was designated to do, she wasn't able to do, which was reproduce. And that put her in a very threatening position.
Adultery could be a dangerous game, but for Catherine, nothing was more risky than remaining childless. Soon she delivered what the Empress required, a baby. Paul. Historians still debate whether the royal heir was fathered by Catherine's husband or her lover. Having performed her duty, Catherine was cast aside, discarded by her husband, the Empress, and their circles at court. But the Grand Duchess had already developed an appetite for power.
Catherine became a student of silent observation, and in doing that, she learned all the customs of Russia, the language. She even converted to the Russian Orthodox Church as a way of incorporating herself into the system.
She learned Russian politics. She liked politics. She read widely to keep herself abreast of European thinking. So for all of these reasons, Catherine became a very attractive figure at court.
Catherine had been bold since childhood, and now with a royal heir to her credit, she waded into the political fray. At one dinner, she warned the French ambassador to mind her ambitions.
There never was a woman bolder than I. I have unbridled audacity.
Peter and Catherine drifted from distant relations to open hostility. The Tsar-to-be warned that once he succeeded Elizabeth on the throne, he might lock his wife in a convent or dispose of her entirely. But while her husband threatened, Catherine built defenses and planned for the future. She forged alliances with generals and politicians throughout the empire and across Europe. In 1758, Catherine's growing web of influence caught the attention of the Empress Elizabeth. To cover her tracks, Catherine burned her journals and correspondence. Then she met the Tsarina for a private conference to discuss Catherine's loyalty and Elizabeth's unsatisfactory heir, Peter.
It certainly had been planted in Catherine's mind that she might like to be empress in her own right. So there was plotting, and people who recognized Peter as being incompetent, feared despotic tendencies in his character, rallied around Catherine.
While Peter and Catherine sparred, the Empress Elizabeth's armies marched into battle. The empire's enemy, Prussia, and its warrior king, Frederick the Great, a man the German-born Grand Duke Peter had idolized all his life. Prussian conquests had shaken Europe's balance of power. Elizabeth had joined an alliance to quash Frederick's upstart Germanic Empire. By 1761, Russian forces had gained the upper hand. In St. Petersburg, heroes from the front returned to adoring throngs. The greatest hero of them all, the guardsman Grigory Orlov, swept the Grand Duchess Catherine off her feet.
Grigory Orlov was the second of the 5 Orlov brothers, all of whom were handsome, all of whom were reckless, all of whom were dashing. And Catherine fell in love with the said Gregory Orlov, and he was the one who helped organize the guards to support her bid for the throne.
Catherine and the Orlov brothers dubbed Peter the Monster. They despised his childish ways and Prussian fixation. As the year ended, events came to a head. At the front, the Russian army had overrun Berlin. Frederick the Great was on his knees. His German kingdom was about to be wiped off the map. At the palace, Grand Duke Peter was in despair at the impending defeat of his beloved Prussia, while his Aunt Elizabeth was poised for victory. Then came Christmas Day. Elizaveta Petrovna Romanova, 52 years old, sole surviving child of Peter the Great, Tsarina and Empress of Russia, fell dead.
Elizabeth really had created the modern Russian European-type court. European court was unthinkable without women, and women had not been at all prominent at the Muscovite court.
In many ways, Empress Elizabeth, despite her flaws, was a role model for Catherine on that a woman can be in charge and have power.
The Empress's nephew and heir to the throne, the German princeling Peter III, danced for glee at Elizabeth's funeral. In his first act as Tsar, Peter declared peace with Prussia, sparing his hero Frederick from annihilation and infuriating the entire Russian army. And the new Tsar wouldn't stop there. He ordered the officer corps out of the Russian green uniforms he hated and dressed them in Prussian blue. He stripped the icons out of the Russian Orthodox Church he feared and ordered the priests to dress like German Lutheran ministers. And in a final foolhardy adventure, Peter ordered up an invasion force to claim the German homeland he had left 20 years before, the distant Duchy of Holstein. One night, Tsar Peter toasted his impending crusade. When his wife Catherine failed to raise her glass, Peter announced to all that her time had run out.
He was threatening to divorce Catherine, send her to a nunnery, and leave her without anything. And so Catherine realized that the moment had come also for her to act.
The next night, Catherine's lover, Gregory Orlov, his brothers, and their fellow guardsmen led a coup to save Catherine and Russia. They deposed Peter with ease. But for the hapless ex-Tsar, the worst was still to come.
If you are an empress, the only good ex-emperor is a dead ex-emperor.
To keep Catherine's hands clean, Orlov and his brothers dragged Peter out of St. Petersburg. The conspirators' hatred soon got out of hand. A letter to Catherine from Orlov broke the news. The monster was dead. In July of 1762, Peter III, the Tsar of Russia, suffered an unfortunate, fatal accident. He collided with the ambitions of his wife, Catherine the Great.
The official word was that he had died of hemorrhoids, an odd disease to pick, but nonetheless, after he was killed, it became even more important that she establish that she was the savior of Russia and that he was going to crucify Russia.
To depose an unpopular ruler was one thing, but for a German princess to claim the Tsar's crown, Catherine would have to transform herself and the Russian nation.
How did Catherine have the chutzpah to think that she could rule? The hubris, indeed. Well, again, I think she knew she had the talent and she had the backing, and she had become Russian.
She certainly saw herself as legitimate, that she was the competent person, that she was devoted to Russia and Russia's interests, and that she saved Russia from disaster.
For more than half her life, Catherine had forged allies and studied the path to power. Like her model, the Empress Elizabeth, Catherine seized the throne with a coup. Then, to consecrate her authority, she headed to the cathedrals of the Kremlin to be crowned.
She immediately orchestrated a brilliant coronation in which she was celebrated as elected by the people. And then she embarked upon a program of reform. That was how you demonstrated your fitness for the throne after Peter the Great. You reformed. You became a reforming Tsar.
At 33 years old, a German princess had claimed the authority of the Russian emperor. The Empress Catherine the Great's lust for knowledge and power would prove to be the stuff of legend and the engine of history. She filled the rooms of St. Petersburg's palaces with art by the great masters, turning her Hermitage into the world's greatest museum. She collected admirers like she stockpiled art, powerful friends and devoted lovers, men she used to cement her hold on power and ease the burdens of imperial rule. Her hunger for land expanded the empire in almost every direction. From Eastern Europe to Alaska and America's Pacific Northwest, Catherine reigned supreme. Above all, she pursued reform. She promoted local government. She chartered schools and universities. She encouraged Russia's elites to challenge tradition. And in so doing, lit the fuse for revolutionary change in Russia.
The entire Russian elite felt as though they were having a honeymoon period with her because they discovered that finally they had an empress who spoke the same language as they did, the language of the Enlightenment, who had the same goals as they did, namely to make Russia a state based on law, not based on personal rule, and they applauded this empress of theirs.
Catherine seized the Russian throne in 1762, in the Age of Enlightenment. Philosophers and writers heralded the rights of man and the belief that reason could perfect human society. Catherine saw herself as a priestess of the liberal movement.
Liberty, the soul of everything. Without you, all is dead.
Yet the rights of man confronted the Empress Catherine with a dangerous paradox. For in Russia, where the economy was built on the slave labor of the serfs, human rights was an explosive ideal.
It's precisely because you have this enormous gap between sections of educated society and the realities of Russian life, and indeed the values and the mentality of the bulk of the peasant population, that Russia becomes increasingly difficult to govern.
The plight of Russia's serfs gnawed at Catherine's high ideals. Still, the Empress knew her crown depended on the loyalty of the nobility. To free the serfs would undermine the nobles and her throne. But in villages along the Volga, the peasants took liberation into their own hands. In 1773, a Cossack and army deserter, Emelian Pugachev, proclaimed himself to be Catherine's dead husband, Tsar Peter III. He called on the masses to overthrow the tyrant queen.
Pugachev set up a court and started issuing edicts, quite of a revolutionary nature. Namely, let us exterminate the officials and the landlords, let us end taxation and end military equipment, free the serfs, and divide up the land. So this was quite a revolutionary and attractive to many parts of the population.
For over a year, rebellion gripped the Volga River basin. The rebels murdered hated landowners and sacked their homes. But even as they swelled to over 100,000 men, Pugachev's forces would prove no match for Catherine's army. In 1774, the pretender was captured, brought to court in an iron cage, interrogated, and executed. His peasant revolt died with him. The fate of Russia's working poor would haunt the empire to its death. But for Catherine, human rights ended where they threatened her absolute rule.
It's been said by people who were in her entourage that she developed a fear of the common people and a conviction that it was much too early to free the serfs.
Like Tsar Peter the Great, Catherine was committed to reform, but survival came first. And for a Russian ruler, survival often depended on raw power, conquest, and expansion.
There's a very clear logic in Russia's expansion, just as there's also a political logic. I mean, the ruling class of Russia is a landowning aristocratic class. Territorial expansion brings them enormous benefits. The state itself is a sort of deal between the Tsar and the aristocracy, and both of them gain tremendously from expansion.
Catherine knew that one territorial goal had always tantalized the Tsars: to expand Russia to the shores of the Black Sea. Seizing the Black Sea coast from the Ottoman Empire would become the Tsarina's enduring obsession. In 1768, Catherine's armies marched into years of warfare with the Ottoman Turks and their allies. The struggle would shape much of Catherine's reign and her personal life.
Obviously, she could not be a general in the field, but she paid a lot of attention to the armed forces, made sure they were loyal to her. She gave them all sorts of favors.
One victorious commander in the Turkish campaigns won special favor from the Empress, Grigory Alexandrovich Potyomkin. As the Turks gave way in the south, Potyomkin gained sway in the court. Soon, his position eclipsed old favorites like Grigory Orlov.
Potemkin was tall, one-eyed, he lost an eye, greasy, brutish, all qualities that repulsed most women, but to Catherine, he was just the end. And through satisfying her, he gained a lot of power in the kingdom.
The moody, battle-scarred warrior became the Empress's closest advisor and the great love of her life. He was awarded chambers in the Winter Palace, and for years he could be seen roaming the halls at night.
From all sources, it appears that they had a very passionate affair, and they may have been secretly married. And here you have an example, once again, of Catherine using someone who grew into becoming a great statesman, one of the great statesmen in all of Russian history.
Catherine enlisted Potyomkin in her plan to dismember the ailing Ottoman Empire. The critical first step: conquer the strategic Black Sea peninsula, the Crimea. The Crimea dominated the Black Sea. Control of the peninsula would give Russia a commanding southern stronghold. For years, Potyomkin guided Catherine's assault on the Crimea. In 1784, Russia would officially take control of the peninsula. To show her gratitude, the Empress anointed Potyomkin Prince of Crimea. After 20 years on the throne, the Empress Catherine had realized the age-old dream of the Tsars. Russia had seized the Crimea and become a leading Black Sea power. To commemorate her reign, Catherine unveiled a monument to Peter the Great in the heart of St. Petersburg. The magnificent bronze horseman became a symbol of her legitimacy, one more link in the chain between a German princess and the dynasty of the Romanovs.
She wanted to make clear to them that she was going to follow the kinds of policies that Peter the Great had, that Russia was going to be great again. And she actually was offered the title of the Great in the first year of her reign, and she rejected and said, "This is absurd. This is only something that posterity can decide."
Catherine now considered herself truly Russian. Once, when doctors came to bleed the Empress, she joked that she hoped they would drain the last drop of her German blood. In the end, Catherine's legacy would be shaped by blood. Blood in the streets of Paris over 1,000 miles away. The blood of the French Revolution. The Empress Catherine of Russia entered the last decade of the 18th century as the most powerful woman on earth. Her dominion stretched from Poland to Alaska. She ruled nearly 30 million nobles, commoners, and serfs with a firm hand and firm faith in progress and reform.
Catherine introduced public participation in government in a way that had never occurred before in Russian history, and thereby laid the foundations for what is called today a civil society. She is one of the greatest monarchs of the 18th century, one of the greatest monarchs in Russia, and perhaps one of the greatest monarchs of all time.
But the almighty empress was powerless to affect history a continent away. And in the late 18th century, Russia's destiny was being shaped in the streets of Paris. 1793, revolutionary terror claimed the life of Louis XVI, King of France. For Catherine, his execution was a crime against God's will.
She saw Louis XVI beheaded, and she started doubting the Enlightenment ideals that may have resulted in all of this. So she became somewhat panicked by the French Revolution.
In 1796, the revolution flooded out of France as the army of the French Republic marched into Italy, led by a brilliant young commander. Napoleon Bonaparte had made his entrance on the grand stage of history. Now 67 years old, Catherine knew her own exit from history was not far off. She was adamant that her empire would continue to be led not by a populist mob, but by her own flesh and blood. By law, Catherine could choose whom she pleased as heir to her throne, and the Tsarevich, Paul, the son she had borne for her murdered husband Peter, was not necessarily first choice.
Catherine was afraid of Paul. She saw qualities in him, dangerous qualities. He was a cruel, unstable, dangerous person. And he asked a lot of questions about what had happened to his father and why was his mother on the throne. And that made him dangerous to Catherine.
Unwelcomed and uncomfortable in his mother's court, the Tsarevich devoted his life to drilling and re-drilling his Prussian-style battalions. In Catherine's eyes, the thing Paul did best was to breed children, particularly his firstborn, the Grand Duke Alexander.
Alexander had a difficult, interesting childhood and adolescence. He was in a sense stuck between his grandmother, the Empress Catherine, and his father. Alexander more or less had to be everything to both of them, pretending that he sympathised with both sides. And that bred in him a certain caution, a certain tendency always to be charming to everyone, to make everybody believe that he agreed with them.
Catherine had the finest liberal scholars tutor Alexander in Enlightenment ideals. His father, Paul, taught him to be a military drill master. As Catherine faced mortality, the question of her successor, her son or her grandson, loomed large. November 5th, 1796. The aging empress was paralyzed by a stroke. The following night, the German princess who had ruled the Russian Empire for 34 years was dead.